Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hope you had a great break. I know there were some rich discussions during the breakout sessions, and I hope you had a little dance break and got to move around. We really want to get excited for our closing plenary speaker, Ms. Makani Themba of Higher Ground Change Strategies, as she presents Beyond Story, Aligning Narrative and Systems Change to Advance Climate Justice. So we are so excited to have you with us, Makani, for the remainder of our afternoon. Before we get into our social hour, I will turn it over to you, and I'll just make a note to everyone that we're going to have breakout sessions during this closing panel, so be on the lookout for a message in your inbox that has the link to your specific breakout session. And Makani, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie, and hello, everyone. Thank you. This has been quite a day. I can't believe it went by so quickly. So I'm really pleased to have this conversation with you. A couple of things. One is I know many of the folks who are here. Unfortunately, I can't see you, but I know you're here, and so grateful that you are. So one, I want to just express my greetings from Jackson, Mississippi, and my kitchen, literally, which is one of the great things about virtual living is we get to kind of operate from the places we love. So from my home to yours, I'm glad that we're about to have this conversation. So we're going to talk about narrative power, and we're going to talk about how to think about rooting our stories. Because one of the things that happens a lot of the times is folks act like the reason why our stories aren't told is because we don't have good stories or we're not telling them well enough. And there's like a whole industry around beating up activists, beating up organizers, to have them feel bad, right? Around what they're not doing about their story, and that's often because people confuse narrative power with a powerful narrative, right? And hopefully by the end of our session, we'll get a chance to talk more about that. So I see some questions, and hopefully you all can see me, and I'm checking if that's not the issue. If I'm still hanging out backstage and I'm not with you, let me know. So let's start with a little poll if we're ready, just to see where folks are at. Thank you. So, okay, it's pretty even. We've got almost a third and a third and a third. All right, let's try one more polling question. Now that we know how to do it, let's do the second one. Now everybody knows where they are. We're gonna switch it out, I think, real quick and come up with a second question. And it's okay. You can be any of those things: a beginner, getting your bearings, an expert, because this is really a conversation about how we institutionalize these narratives, and everybody's going to know something about that, right? And if we don't have it together, that's okay. We can skip it. So let's do this. And I realize I actually may be doing this from backstage, but that's okay. We're going to work it out. So if we don't have the other poll questions quite ready, let's see. Oh, yes, we have them ready. All right. So if you click on polls again, you'll see a new question. And this is not about you personally, but about your organization. So if you take a moment to answer that one. Now this virtual life, yes, here we go. Okay. So we have a significant number of folks, really 2/3, who are in their organization who's still working on building clarity or shared definition, and a significant more than a quarter of folks who answered. The organization is not in active discussion yet about narrative change, and that's okay too, because we're here to talk about all of that and how to begin to think about it. So I think I'm going to go ahead and let's see. Well, we did have one more poll. What do you think, Angel? Do you think we can get it up, or should I just keep rolling? I am good either way. All right. So, so one of the things that we're well, I want to sort of stress as we talk about this. This is not going to be about like how to make your story sexy, which I know a lot of the narrative conversations are about that, like the characters, all of that. And a lot of times people also get confused about what narrative means. They think it's some kind of magical word that's different from story, but it's not really. It's basically the same thing. I think the main thing that we want to sort of hold is that when you think about narrative, you think about it being narrated, right? You think about it's a story, it's a sequence of events, it's and the way that we work with it as organizers and activists is we're thinking not only about the ways in which people will tell the story, but also how people are going to hear the story, because a narrative is literally something that's narrated, right? So, so we want to, sort of let that go in terms of it being like some kind of fancy thing that's beyond us. If you know about a story, you know about narrative, because basically they're a synonym for each other. So we have the poll up. Okay, I think I took enough time for that. And so in this one, we're going to ask you to sort of make an assessment about the dominant conversation that we're dealing with in terms of like that intersection between climate crisis and equity. So pick the one that you think best describes where the dominant conversation is. Is it all we hope for and more like, yay, we're about done? We're making good headway on climate, but not so much on the equity or health lens part of it. Like people aren't quite making that connection. Or saying that there's some progress, but not enough in any of the dimensions. Like there may be a little progress on the so-called climate part, but not enough, and not enough in the other dimensions, in the ways in which we're trying to frame this and shape it. Or maybe there's something else. And if there is a something else, I'm hoping that if you answered something else, you drop that in the chat, what you're thinking. So go ahead and pick the one that works for you. Yay. And then we'll get into more of the sort of traditional kind of conversation before we go into breakouts. And I'm also mindful that I am the person standing between you and all those awesome, I should say, not awful, awesome treats that we have. Some people are like, well, I'm multitasking, I'm answering the questions, and I'm already into all of the treats and the social things. So nobody said that it's all we hope for. That's no surprise, right? A little less than a quarter said, good on the climate, aspect of it, even though it's all climate, of course. And, but not as good on the other aspects. And then, but most of you said that there's progress, but it's not what we want in any dimension of this work. So thank you for that. We'll start to kick up the slides, and I hope I can see them. But I have them here so I can look, and then we'll hopefully, all right. There we go. Yay. I can see them. And so, one of the things we're going to, let's start with the second slide once we get it into presentation view. So I'm going to start with I feel like, Kamara and her gardening tale always is inspiring and feels so clear. And, one of the things that's been happening for me in this work around narrative power, and I've been so excited because I've been working on this cartoon and some other things with this amazing team. So there'll be more on this. But bottom line is that a lot of times we think about the stories that we're trying to tell, and the stories that, like, for a moment they felt like they were holding on and they were becoming bigger and people were getting it, and then they disappear, right? You think of, that young lady or this person or that march or that thing that happened where we could feel like, wait, we were making headway, or wait, there's a moment where we're able to, like, almost see the shift, and then it disappears. And then people forget, what we were talking about, and we have to tell them over and over and over again. And so that is really fundamentally why we talk about what does it mean to reshape the systems and institutions as part of this process of narrative, right? So there's this little pyramid that was that someone trying to tell me something? Or just a little sound? Okay, just making sure. Here we go. It's a little disconcerting, but I'm here. I'm focused. We're making it happen. So this little pyramid that you can see at the top, you'll see an issue. And that's sort of the surface where we tend to sort of think about our work. And in some ways, you think of stories as seeds. And we'll have good stories, they'll be great seeds, but we don't really have the soil or the conditions or the space for our stories to root. And so that's part of the challenge, right? That we come up with all these stories and we're just throwing them out there. And we don't have an institutional framework for how we're going to root those stories so they continue to replicate and be reproduced. Here we go. I have a feeling something good's about to happen. And that's really important. So when you think about how do you know what you know, and I'm gonna look in the chat and ask you to sort of drop your answers in the chat, like when you think about your own, I don't want to say ideology, but your view about life and the things that you remember and you hold close. Where did you learn them from? Can you drop in the chat for me some of the places where you learned how to be who you are? Now, I see a lot of people putting their families in, which is really important. Yeah, the playground is a place. Home and church, yes. Friends. Yep. School's critical. Your coach. There's a lot of church and mom. Synagogue. Now, as you think about that, where do you think they got it from? Where do you think your mom and your grandma, your family got their ideas from? All right, we're getting there. We just go one more slide. Yep. TV shows. Yeah, media plays a role, right? Because when you think about it, school teaches us what's fact, right? And oftentimes our faith communities teach us what may feel like truth. And television, media, film, books, a lot of that. I said, my mama was born with the truth. All right, Paul, I see you. that there's a lot of things that we take for granted as facts that we learned in school, right? That that Darwin invented a thing called the theory of evolution. That Columbus discovered America, right? Like all of these, there's a lot of ideas that even if we don't personally believe them, we know them. They're somewhere in our brains and our bodies, right? Because what happens a lot of times when we're having these conversations, right? We have the issue at hand, climate crisis, racism, all of that. Oh, can you go back, please? I'm not finished with that slide. Right. And I do hear a little background noise, and maybe there's somebody on who has to mute or something, but we're going to work it out. So, and then we have this idea that, like, sort of the context that things happen in, like, who's in government, all of these things, right? And yes, the life we live, that current context around, like, my parents came up during the Depression, and that was a really important event, set of conditions, right? That not only shaped many of our parents and grandparents, but also shaped this country, right? And during that time, there was all kinds of openings to different kinds of ideas about the economy, about how it worked, and this idea of people being in it together, right? That poverty was something that was widespread, and then folks worked really hard who were like anti-union and wanted to have a different kind of values to say, well, actually, poverty is your own fault, which is really different than how many people came up during the Depression, right? So this idea, the current context, whatever, however it's shaping and what the official story is, the policy that's happening, and then beneath that, further still, are the history and beliefs that shape it. Like, what do people learn in school about a thing and their memory? And when you think about equity or climate crisis or and the intersection, and you think, what does a belief about people of color and that bad things happen to them because they do bad things shape our capacity and ability to break through on talking about, the levels of which equity and climate crisis come together. When folks look at the damage, you think about a Katrina, or you look at some of the other things that have happened in terms of tsunamis in Asia and places like that, it's like brown people who have bad things happen to them, right? And so we're in this conversation, and then the power relations that hold all of this together, right? We're in a conversation with all of this, not just our opinions, but the whole range of the institutions and how they reinforce our values or other values. That's part of the conversation. And so it's almost like we have these seeds that are our stories, and there's some institutions that also lean in our direction. There's more and more, for example, faith institutions that are thinking about the earth and thinking about equity and thinking about the importance for us to recognize our interconnectedness to the entire planet and to each other, right? Like that's an important set of values that help support what we're trying to say. But next slide, please. But the other piece of that is that we're engaged in learning and listening and gathering information from a whole range of areas. So when we think about being comprehensive and how we understand these various institutions and how they work, there's just a whole range of strategies. And I'm not going to spend too much here because I really want to get to the next slide. But basically, you can see, like, here's some of the different ways that people are communicating with us and that are important for us to communicate with folk, right? Like these different platforms. But I want to go to the next slide, because this is really where we're going to spend our time and focus in the little time we have left. Is that, and I want to focus on this hexagon, I think is what it is, at the bottom, that talks about institutionalizing our story, right? So, we need to have that advocacy infrastructure. We need to have channels that are open to us. We need to produce stories. But one of the places that or the spheres of work that are often overlooked is how we institutionalize and root our stories. So next slide, please. So we're trying to communicate this integrated framework, right? There's this place where we're helping people understand that the undergirding factors around climate crisis, which have to do also with the economy and what we value, people that we don't value enough and that we don't see the connection. And then the idea that we have to care about climate crisis for all kinds of reasons, including that if we don't, we jeopardize our health and well-being as well as the planet. That there are lots of reasons why we should care. And we're trying to communicate also that the impact is not equal, right? That there's just that we need to understand, and for us to understand and address climate crisis in a just and equitable manner, we have to have an equity lens, as we say. We have to look at that. So we all know that. That's what we're working with. So we're going to go to the next slide, though. And so when we think about shifting belief and winning public support, there are three things that really two first to get to the third thing that we have to root and that we have to make sure is being taught and reproduced and replicated in our institutions and all the places where meaning happens, right? So one is a shared understanding of our interconnectedness. That when we see someone in New Orleans or thousands of people in New Orleans in a stadium and treated and mistreated by the government, that we should feel connected. We should feel connected to people in pain. We should feel connected and responsible, and to each other as human beings and to the planet. And that's an important framework for us to hold in order for us to do our work. When you think of whatever public health issue we're working on, one of the main reasons why we aren't able to build the kind of public support that we need to is because we're constantly battling the fact that the folks who make decisions don't value the people that we're talking about in our own communities. And so we have to organize, we have to get loud, we have to do all the things to help them understand why it's important. We essentially have to raise the cost of their ignoring us by advocating, because folks are not seeing the connection between us as human beings and the importance of why we need to work on these issues together, and that it matters. That it matters to all of us, as Dr. Kamar Jones was talking about earlier, in terms of like, we're all in this garden. And so many of our institutions do not back that idea up, right? It's very competitive. It's there's a lot of racism interwoven in our schooling, in our education, in our films, in our television shows, in our music, that we don't even realize. And so part of it is seeding, not only throwing out the stories, but how do we root them in these institutions that reproduce the culture, right? And part of the reason why people don't understand our interconnectedness is because we don't have a shared understanding of the past and how we got here. Some people think, well, the reason why there's racism is because it's justified because there's these people who just don't know how to act right. And then there are other folks who are like all of us, I hope, in this room. It's like this country and this world, unfortunately, has had a history of exploitation, of domination, of conquest that has created these long-standing inequities and injustices. And we've got to fix that. We've got to repair that. We've got to restore that in order for us to move forward. And that gets us to the third area, because with this understanding that we're all connected, and with this understanding about the past and how we got there, then we can start to really build a shared vision and understanding of how we fix what's wrong. And so this work of shifting belief and winning public support is more than just coming up with really good slogans and ideas, even though those are great. But we have to think about, how do we root these ideas in the institutions that teach us, that rear us, that help us shape our own identity about who we are and who we believe. So we go to the next slide, and we're going to go to breakouts pretty soon. So I'm going to ask you just to warm us up. So we have in climate crisis and climate change, we're doing a good job of using schools and getting curricula in as a way to root some of our ideas. So I'm just curious, when you think, and I want to use the chat, please, for that. What are some of the institutions that you know of that reproduce stories and meaning related to our work that we're doing here around climate and equity and health equity? So if you wouldn't mind sharing that in the chat. So I know folks were talking about schools and churches and film. Yes, hospitals, definitely. Think about, I am a person who came out of tobacco control work, and I remember when hospitals used to allow smoking. That was, and doctors would be in tobacco commercials, right? If that doesn't happen anymore. And in fact, I feel like I've learned so much from that movement as a way of, helping me understand the importance of institutions, the importance of rooting our work in things like schools and hospitals, right? Yes. Video, that's the viral video, community groups, right? But when we think about institutions, though, yes, philanthropy, YouTube, okay, institution. Yes, universities, absolutely, right? So and then we think about, what will keep telling the story after we're gone, right? Who holds these stories after we're gone? So yeah, universities are super important. Yes, music and artists, literature. Yes, local public health departments are an important institution that reproduce, practice all kinds of things, right? So you guys get the idea. Can we do the next slide? Yes, books, definitely. Books are more important than, in fact, it's not even important if people read the book. The fact that there's a book on a thing makes a difference. How many books, at least maybe I'm only speaking for myself, but I do know a lot of people who have lots and lots of books they don't read just because of the title and what they heard about it. And the idea is already in their head, right? That they're like, oh, this book is about this. Great, I'm going to buy it. And I'm holding the idea without ever having read the book. And if we can't get to that next slide, it's okay. We can. All right, here we go. So here's a resource, and as we get ready to go into breakouts, that I love from the Zen Education Project on climate change. It talks about climate and equity. and health together. And if you're not familiar with that, and an exceptional, really wonderful resource, and one that I hope will be in more and more schools as more states have adopted the climate change curriculum requirements, which was a really visionary organizing move on behalf of this movement, which I know many of you were involved in, right? Yes, exactly. And the science is important because the science is a contested area, right? Which I know you all know. It's like, what should climate change models include? What should they not include, right? Okay, I know we are running behind time, so I need to do a check-in to see if we're able to do breakouts or if we're running out of time. And okay, yes, we can. All right, so let's go ahead and get to it. And I appreciate you all's patience as we work out all of the things that the virtual life requires. So we'll just spend about 10 minutes in breakouts. And I would love for you all to just spend those 10 minutes talking a little bit about this idea of institutionally rooting our ideas, where you think that makes sense, where you think there's potential. So you should have links. You can go ahead there and we'll see you back in 10 minutes. We are back. So one, I want to just thank you all for your patience while we figure out this hop in or hop out or whatever we're about to do. So thank you for your patience. This has been a definite learning experience, as our whole pandemic life has been. I know we didn't have a lot of time in a group, and there was a sort of flip in terms of you even getting the questions, but we did talk about them. So I just want to take a minute to have you drop in the chat as you reflect on your like mini sessions, or if you had a chance to go to a session, if you had some trouble with your link, you can answer in the chat now. You think about our work, what we're trying to do here. What do you think people need to understand and believe and just really take for granted, right? What should folks understand, believe, and take for granted? And if they do that, you know we're winning. So I'd love to hear what you think in the chat about that. So when I think about that, I think about, I want people to understand that their livelihood, their life is tied up in the health of the planet and others. I want people to believe that everyone is a human being worthy of dignity and respect. And I think about many of the cartoons and claymation shows of the 60s and how they really reflected many of those values. There used to be, some people are old enough to remember Davy and Goliath, which was actually a claymation kind of children's program that talked about values of sharing and caring about people who are different than you. Of course, there's Sesame Street, who are like the GOAT, the greatest of all time in terms of helping children understand complex, important issues through a lens of justice and dignity and love. Yes. Yes. You think about, yes, you want people to take for granted that they're safe, no matter who the folks look like in the elevator, right? And I'll give folks a minute. And then if you're like, that's maybe not my question, but if you can just even think about it and note to yourself, because that's really where we're trying to get to. Like when we think about narrative and we think about narrative change, it's not enough to change a story for a moment if people don't believe it or hold it or at one point take for granted. And I'll say that again, it's not enough to change a story because it will only be temporary if we don't change what people understand and believe and take for granted. That's where the institutional framework comes in. That's why it's going to be super important for us to think about, like, how deep can we go with this curriculum work? How do we change what universities teach and value is important? And this is a contested field, right? We're looking at our opponents tearing down ethnic studies, going for it because they know what happens when people learn something different about the past. There was a question, which I think is a super important question, that I'm sorry, and I'm losing the name of the person who sent it, but that's okay. But I do remember the question, and that is whether or not the U.S. It's from Jerome. In the U.S. today, is there any shared understanding of how we get there? And unfortunately, the answer is no. There's definitely a set of us who have more of a sense of history. In fact, many of those folks refer to themselves as woke, right? Because they're waking up from this dream of the lies of the stories about how we got here and who belongs here and who doesn't. And so it's such an interesting term too, because it kind of says, well, the rest of the folks, right, are asleep, that they're not aware, that they don't know the truth. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? And being woke, right, is a process. And some of us get some of it by experience, but then we find these unwoke places, these places where we drank the Kool-Aid too and we didn't know. Maybe it's about immigration. Maybe it's about indigenous nations in this country that we don't know much about. Like there's all kinds of things that we have to discover because those stories are not institutionalized in our learning. And so when we think about a strategy for change, we need to think about how we want to change these structures. A story I always tell and think about from tobacco control is I always thought it was amazing that there was an ashtray in a car and not a place to put my purse. And I'm like, what the heck? There are more people getting into a car with a purse than they are smoking. But there's something about tobacco being literally baked into the design of our living, where there were ashtrays everywhere at one point. And then the work to sort of look at institutional behavior and shift that. So that's not as much a thing at all. Now, that's an indicator. So I'd like you to take a minute as we get ready to close, and also if there's any questions, I want to take those really quickly, but I'm also looking for guidance around that. Is what institutions and structures where you are, and just take note to yourself, where you are, where you feel like we can recapture the story. We can root the story here. We can have it so that kids who are starting kindergarten in September of this year, when they graduate from high school, they're going to have a whole different set of values and understanding about the earth and about each other. And they're ready to be global citizens of the planet. Like, what would that look like? And how can we do that right where we are? What do we want people to understand about climate change as policymakers, as academicians, as researchers, as filmmakers? One of the things that I thought was so powerful too, again, a lesson from tobacco control, is that CDC used to sponsor a regular, and it's actually they may still do, but I'm not sure. I think that might have ended under the other president before this one, that where there were meetings with screenwriters that was sponsored by CDC to help them better understand health issues, including tobacco control and other things, and then write about it, which was really powerful. And I know that there are folks who are doing that work that's really important. So think about right where you are. What are some of the institutions that would be really important in helping to amplify and root and reproduce the stories? And the last thing I'll say as we close, and I'll check in for any questions or anything else, is that imagination is really underrated as a terrain for our work as social change agents. It's the most contested terrain, though, of our lives. The way television works, the way stereotypes fill our brains, like all of these things. And that the biggest part of how we're governed is really about our imagination, what we think is possible, what we think we deserve, what we think is worthy. And so part of this work of building narrative power is also about how we think about contesting for and getting into the public imagination about the possibility that we can live in a way that is better for the planet, that it's not a lost cause, that we can imagine something different. That's going to be critical, that we can imagine a different relationship with each other. That contesting for the public imagination is going to be really about the most important thing we do if our work is going to hold and people are going to roll with us and believe that something can be different.